All right, guys, how you guys doing? Here we are for another lecture episode of Chapman's history class. So here we go. We're talking about chapter 20, and we're talking about the Cold War. As you guys can see here, got a little image of President Kennedy in the background. I know it may be a little difficult to see, but you guys got to understand that President Kennedy was a pretty young. He was our youngest president ever. Pretty good-looking young man, and the reason why he's really elected in the 1960 presidential election is due to the fact he had television. This is the first time television was used in presidential debates. And in the debates between President Kennedy and Richard Nixon looked as if he was a little old, a little gaunt. He had a 5 o'clock shadow going on in his face, didn't look like he shaved. And then you have the young, brash, handsome, sharp-dressed President Kennedy. And the nation took notice, particularly the women of America took notice at this time period, and it really helped Kennedy become the president of the United States in 1960. Some of the things you guys got to understand in the presidency of Kennedy was there was a lot of controversy. He's only going to be president for a little under 3 years. He takes office in January, of course, 1961 after the elections. And he dies in office in 1963, so he never did live out his full term as president in office, but he was able to do some pretty significant things during his presidency, so we'll look at those. Kind of the main reason why Kennedy really starts to separate himself from Nixon, let alone the television appearances that he had, was the fact that you begin to have the blacks in America that really begin to support Kennedy. Why? Because you had the support of Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, the civil rights issues of the 1950s brought the name Martin Luther King Jr. into the limelight, and blacks were really starting to follow him because of his nonviolent protesting ideas. Really helped cement him as the leader of the black movement, and he then throws his support behind Kennedy, and really helps catapult Kennedy into that presidency. You guys got to realize up to 1960, we've had some very close presidencies in terms of elections. You go all the way back and look at the presidential election of 1800 as one of them. But in terms of popular vote, in terms of overall vote and electoral vote, you're looking at, this was probably the closest presidential election in history at this time period. You guys lived through one. 2000 is probably the closest, but this was a very close one, and a lot of the reason why he was elected president was the fact, again, one, because he was handsome and women came out and voted for him in large numbers, and he did get the minority vote during this time period, so a very key in helping him win his years. Now, because he was this kind of handsome looking gentleman right here, he and his wife became very iconic in terms of their fashion. And what begins to happen is they begin to dress very elaborately, and they begin to become icons in the fashion world during this time period. And a lot of people look at them, dress like them, and there was this little sense of maybe like a king and queen, and henceforth the nickname to his presidency were known as the Camelot years. If you know anything about Camelot, that's King Arthur and his knights of shining armor at the Round Table. That's the folklorish kind of mythological king. That Camelot years was cast, that name was cast on the Kennedy years, just because of the elegance and the elaborateness of what he brought to the administration. So we'll move on to the next slide. And this really shows Kennedy and his wife entering into a ball, and you can see women would look and see what President Kennedy's wife was wearing. Her name is Jacqueline Kennedy. And no different than we have today, a lot of people look at Mrs. Obama as what she's wearing, and there was a big run on dresses one time. She said, well, I bought my dress at Target or Kmart or whatever it was, and she's had a couple different dresses out there from different companies. All of a sudden that store was sold out of those dresses within hours because she had let it known where she had bought that dress. So sometimes you guys got to realize that our presidents are kind of like these movie stars, these rock star concepts, and people really want to follow them in terms of that. But that's a little bit on the Camelot years. The next couple things that began to hit in President Kennedy's administration are very dramatic. We have some very radical times that are occurring, And one of the things that he really starts to respond to with his politics is this term called flexible response. And as it says, flexible response is keeping the fight out of the hands of nuclear weapons. Don't want to use the nuclear weapons. You don't want to tip that balance and use that, because people begin to realize that nuclear weapons really aren't as great as they thought. Yes, they're a deterrent, but they're not something you really want to use, because again, nuclear weapon goes off, material goes up in the air, goes in the jet stream, comes around and falls on you as well. So it's not the greatest thing for Earth. But he began to come up with an idea called flexible response that's using different type of weaponry. Again, kind of going back to the conventional weaponry, but it's using diplomacy, it's using boycotts, it's using the threat of conventional weaponry. And this was just something that he wanted to do. He didn't want to use the Eisenhower means of, if you threaten me, we're going to go to all-out war. So that really shows Kennedy taking a different stance as compared to previous administrations. Now, we have this big thing that happens with Cuba, and this is really kind of the centerpiece of President Kennedy's administration. In the first couple, year and a half, he's really plagued with this Cuban crisis. And what happens, as you guys should know, that Fidel Castro is able to wrestle control of Cuba, turns the country communist against the United States. Remember, go back to the Spanish-American War. We fought to free Cuba and gave them their independence during that time period, and then they decide later on, almost 60 years later, that they're going to convert and switch over to communism. That was a big threat to the United States. So that was something that he had to deal with, and it was tough, because here you are, you have a neighboring country who was very economically viable, had a lot of sugar. A lot of people don't know that Cuba, particularly Havana, was like the Las Vegas / Hawaii. If you took Las Vegas and Hawaii, combine them, that's in a sense what Havana was. It was a tropical gambling paradise. And we had a lot of investment in there, and that was snatched out from the hands of Americans in general for a vacation spot, but also the investors. And how do we handle that? And turning it to communists is really, a traumatic turn of events for us as Americans. So it was pretty tough. With that, that leads to a couple other things, and we'll talk about those coming up. It'll be, of course, the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll see how those things unfold here in just a minute. But as the Cold War continues on, Kennedy is faced with this Cold War, and he's plagued with how do you combat against the Soviets. Now, Eisenhower, during his administration, there was really 8 years of almost silence. Of course, we had the end of the Korean War that occurred right at the beginning of his administration, but during the mid-years, nobody wanted to challenge Eisenhower. He was a general, winning general of World War II, and he didn't mess around. He was somebody who was really kind of staunch in terms of his stance against the Soviets. So we did have a lot of things happen. Right towards the very end of his administration, we do have the U-2 spy plane incident, and we did have Sputnik that popped in there. And that space race really starts to charge in the President Kennedy's administration. So as you can see up here in the thing, it's called the Race to the Moon. And what begins to happen is we're kind of lagging behind. Sputnik, of course, is a satellite. And now you have Yuri Gagarin, the first Soviet to be launched into outer space and circumnavigate Earth and come back safely. That really scared Americans, because are the Soviets truly ahead of us? And that was the push of President Kennedy's administration, was to find what we could do to get to the moon. So the race to the moon was the key. And he projected that we'd have an American on the moon by the end of the decade. And guess what? We ended up in 1969 able to put our first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong, as you guys know. He's able to land on the moon. So please don't put Lance Armstrong. He was a bicyclist that got caught for using steroids and doping. Wrong guy. I had that put on a test. I just wanted to tell you that. Not Lance Armstrong, Neil Armstrong. And not Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong, of course, was the famous jazz musician. So make sure you guys know that is Neil Armstrong was the first man who landed on the moon for Americans. But really what that did is that really cemented us now as being a nation that can compete in this Cold War and the rush to get into space. What's interesting today, if you guys know anything about our space program today, the United States has shuttled our shuttles for the purpose of safety, and we're trying to look at the next stage. We do have the International Space Station up in space. What I think is interesting, maybe comical is the fact that we rely on the Russians to launch our pilots, our astronauts, into space to get to the International Space Station. So here we are working in partnership today, which is completely different than what would happen. But again, the Cold War is dead, but it was very heated up, particularly during the Kennedy administration. Here's the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs is a very controversial time period. You had a series of events that take place. First, you have the individuals that had fled Cuba because of the threat of communism. These were called Cuban refugees, and they lived in and around Miami. Even still today, you have a lot of Cubans that try to float across the straits there and make it to the Florida Keys or Florida itself. And they find a residency or trying to find families. They want to get out of communism still to this day. But we had a lot flee during the 1959 takeover by Castro. Upon being there, they were really instrumental in trying to get Castro rooted out of there. So as you can see in this image, this shows the failed invasion of the Bay of Pigs. What happened, and again another big controversy in the Kennedy administration, was there wasn't a plan to launch a CIA trained and sponsored takeover of Cuba by means of landing these refugees as well as CIA operatives on the beaches, take out key installations by U.S. air support, and allow the refugees to then take the island. Problem being is Kennedy wasn't in full on this plan, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. When it came time, as the Bay of Pigs invasion goes down, Kennedy refused to send air support, and this really changes the makeup of the Cold War. It becomes very hot during this time period because you had a president that didn't commit to something that they were trying to do in the Cold War, again against communism, and this really causes problems, and you'll see heat up into the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is another big kind of controversial time period in Kennedy's administration. But the Bay of Pigs did not go well. A lot of these guys were rounded up and put in prison. Most of them were executed, and the CIA was very, very angry that Kennedy did not give the air support, which had kind of been pledged prior to even his administration, even by the Eisenhower administration. And that was the thing that really played that out well. So when you look at that and you look at how the invasion takes place and how the support wasn't there, Kennedy's administration really got a black eye in this, and what it really makes him seem is undecisive. He's not sure if he's going to commit or uncommit. So we're going to see that play out when we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you'll hear the big saying, I think the enemy blinked as a concept. I was looking eye to eye with the enemy, and the enemy blinked, and we'll talk about that as a big key piece to that. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, moving on, what had happened is we had U-2 spy planes that were flying over Cuba, taking pictures and just observing what was going on in Cuba since they were now communists, and discovered on some of the flights were these cigar-looking shaped structures and things on the ground. Weren't sure what they were. We looked upon looking further, we realized that these were missiles, and that really freaked us out because now the Soviets were able to bring missiles close enough to the United States that where they could hit pretty much most of the United States, particularly hitting Washington, D.C. And that freaked us out because that was the deal with the Cold War. John F. Kennedy really gets very strong and very staunch on his stance. There's deadlines that are met. If ships aren't turned around that are carrying these missiles aren't turned around, we're going to launch an attack, or we're going to sink the ships or whatever it may be. So it was a very crazy time period, and Nikita Khrushchev being this leader who takes over after Stalin really wants to cement his place in history, and he's trying to challenge this new president, and he's trying to see how far this president will go. Eventually what happens is there's a series called 13 Days where there's just chaos, and if you've ever seen the movie X-Men, I think X-Men First Class or something like that, there's a whole episode of what happens in the Cuban Missile Crisis with Magneto and stuff. It's kind of a cool little spin on it, but yeah, the events that led up to that, that's not how it was handled, but the events that led up to that were very real, and we got to a point where we had our finger over the button instead of the Soviets, and it was really close to actually launching that attack. And luckily for us, the Soviets decided to turn their ships around and withdraw their